I basically break down the human side of data into the framework of 5 Cs, which are competence, collaboration, communication, creativity, and conscience. It started with coming up with the 5 Cs, like how would I describe what for me the main aspects of humanizing data strategy are? I think for sure AI literacy or like dealing with AI tools is going to be a critical skill in the future to be able to navigate it and use it in the right way. What truly excites you right now in the data and AI space? That would be my question, right? Something where it's not like you just have to be excited because everyone's excited about it, but what truly excites you and why?
We are live on the Objective Hiring Show. Tiankai, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to be here.
It is absolutely our pleasure to have you. It's our pleasure to have you because for one of many reasons, but one is you're a published author. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. I am not getting tired of it. I mean, it has been 6 months almost exactly now since releasing a book, but it still feels surreal to be called an author and to be a published author. So thank you very much.
Well, it's absolutely our pleasure, and I've got a copy of your book right here. So for people listening at home, they won't be able to see this, but the front cover is a beautiful, colorful cover with a lot of love hearts. That's kind of permeating the love feeling around the book. The book is called Humanizing Data Strategy, Leading Data with the Head and the Heart. What is the book all about?
Oh, yeah. So the book really is trying to bridge the gap between that everyone agrees in theory that the human side of data is very important, whereas on the other hand, there's not a lot of actual guidance, practical advice on how to deal with the human side of data. And because of comparably very little literature exists, there are some, but not many, about the human side of data, I try to actually basically give it my own attempt to give some practical advice from my experience and from what I learned in my career so far. And yeah, I'm really glad that it appeals to people. I basically break down the human side of data into the framework of 5 Cs, which are competence, collaboration, communication, creativity, and conscience. And to say that to each of these elements, there are things you can do to put people actually first in your data strategy and how to actually empower people, let them collaborate in the right way, have shared objectives, and actually have a meaningful outcome when working with data.
Excellent summary. And what prompted you to write this book?
I mean, it's not as, I would say, romantic as it for other authors is, I would say. Actually, in 2023, I was translating a book in my free time called Disrupting Data Governance by Laura Madsen, very nice book, by the way, into the German language. And I worked with the publisher of Laura's as well, which was Techniques Publications. And their collaboration went so well that at the end of the year, they had asked me if I had any plans to write my own book. And it was only at that time that I even came to the idea of writing my own book. And I thought about what I would write about. And since I've been really specializing and caring about the human side of data so much, I decided basically for that topic. And yeah, then the whole writing process started, and this is where I am now. Yeah.
And how do you even get going on something like that? Like it struck me as I was reading a little bit of the book today, not having written a book myself, it felt a little bit like a startup. Like you have to create something out of nothing, like take an idea in your head and that's all you have to begin with. And then eventually you've ended up with an amazing published book. What is the process like?
I mean, I would describe the process, at least for me, and I'm sure other authors have different approaches, like a mind map that becomes more and more detailed in my head. And actually, for me, it started with coming up with the 5 Cs, like how would I describe what for me the main aspects of humanizing data strategy are? And I kind of said, okay, they all start with C, which is nice. So that means there's something catchy to it and it's easy to remember, right? So let me use that as the narrative and as a structure of it all, right? And how would I then describe the details? So from a very high level mind map, it became more and more structured, more kind of paths went off from each of the content types and aspects. And yeah, then I basically filled in the gaps in many ways. I like thinking what I would want to think about, how it all fits together, and then one more. I would say though, what's interesting is while being in that ideation phase, I got inspired by my day-to-day work a lot as well, right? So there was a lot about situations I was in, topics that I was facing, issues that I was dealing with, that gave me ideas on what would be the potential solution in a given scenario. So while working full-time, writing a book is not easy, but it was almost necessary in my case to pick up the speed, because this is what gave me the day-to-day inspiration to actually have the right content, right? And coming up with what to write about.
Yeah, I guess when you're in the thick of it, and you have this lens through which you're seeing the world, then I guess that helps to highlight the relevant experiences to then include in the book.
Absolutely. Yeah. It also helps when you experience similar situations and scenarios at the like multiple times, you identify patterns, right? And you actually notice that probably other people are facing the same kind of situations. And if you can offer them some kind of inspiration or guidance on how to deal with the situations, that can only make things better, right? It cannot really make things worse that much. So yeah, that is kind of what I had in mind when I wrote the book as well.
One page I was looking at just previously, which really stuck out to me, it's page 16. And on page 16, there's a spectrum that you lay out, which on one side of the spectrum is data focus. So these are data-driven decisions, automated decisions made by machines. On the other side of the spectrum, there's experience-based, experience-focused, no data involved, fully reliant on expertise. And this is an interesting spectrum I often think about in terms of hiring. And I've asked many guests on this show about their thoughts on this when it comes to hiring, like how much they rely on what I would have called gut feel or intuition. I guess here it's framed slightly different. There's experience, but a similar kind of concept, versus how much they rely on data. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on that, how you think about how hiring's done, how you do it. Do you feel like we're going to end up getting more data driven or less? Love to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that in today's hiring, especially in the data space, you cannot really do it all manually anymore, right? Nowadays, you get so many applications to one role that it's impossible to read through all of the cover letters and all of the resumes manually and remembering which ones were relevant and which ones weren't, right? And then having the right mindset for it. So making that screening and that initial kind of assessment of who would actually move to the next stage is happening probably nowadays already pretty much more data driven. That's a lot more of keyword focus to just screen resumes. Also looking into experience with the right industry, for example, really plays around. And that is something that I try to use for help as well, right? On the other hand, right, the more you get closer to making a final decision and the more you are investing time into these job interviews, um, there's the human softer element to it that is important, right? In the end, you need to work together. So the chemistry has to fit. And chemistry is very hard to decode into actual um, data elements, right? Chemistry is something that you just kind of feel. And you would feel like it would be fun to work with that person. And you cannot actually put it into words why it feels like the right chemistry. You can only think of almost experiences in the interview process of when that person was really cool or did something really that you kind of could empathize with. So yeah, I feel like the recruiting process itself is like one of the ultimate um, working with human critical thinking and data together elements that we will never fully replace, because in the end it leads to human collaboration still, and that always requires the human assessment at the very end as well.
Is there something to be said for uh, being almost pushed or controlled too much by our feelings, which are just sort of hiding some kind of bias that we might have? So, as an example, you mentioned there around, let's say, finding someone with whom you might have chemistry and you can imagine working with them and imagine having a fun environment. You could wake up after having slept 8 hours, interview someone and feel great about them. You could have woken up after 1 hour of sleep, your baby was crying, you had an argument with your missus as you're walking out the door, the train was late, you spilled coffee on yourself. Then you interview the same person in some other version of the world and you thought they were a dickhead. So, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's influencing our perception of something. Um, uh, and yes, although in the end we'll have to work with humans, is there not some way that should we be trying to limit how important our feelings are in the hiring process? I guess is what I'm trying to throw at you.
Yeah. No, that's actually a really good point. Just as how important positive feelings are, they can actually have a bad side, right? That we might be biased towards people that are similar to us. We might be biased towards people that have the same experience as us in the past, right? And they are by default more attractive to us, right? Just because we share similar objectives. But objectively for the job, it might need someone actually brings a different point of view. And if you unconsciously focus on same experiences, that's actually not helpful. It's a really good point to think that we as human beings need to acknowledge our unconscious bias and actively work against it, right? To remind ourselves that we should actually be as little biased as possible and to actually stick to what is the best role or the best candidate for a job, right? But at the same time, I'm not sure how much data can help with it, right? So it's one of the things where usually we are facing the facts already. We know that people have different experiences with us or have the same experience with us. It's not like more of the same data can tell us to be less biased. It's almost like a switch in our heads to say, now we have a good feeling about this person, but is it really all valid? Or are things in there just because I personally want to hang out with people that are similar as I? And yeah, I think I agree with you, right? At some point, this is like a limitation of our own emotions. And we actually should try to rationalize a little bit the chemistry and attitudes that we have with candidates.
I'd love to throw an approach at you and see what you think of this. So I tend to find and tend to believe that if we just really thought in a lot of detail about exactly what we were looking for in a candidate, and we just had almost like a meditation session to go through and say, like, okay, let's do a first pass of the skills we want. Here's this list of, I don't know, 6 technical skills, 4 soft skills. Okay, that's a good first start. Then you start talking about what you really look for in a candidate. Oh, remember that candidate who we hired before? They were really good because of X, Y, Z. And here's what this person's going to have to do in this job. And you sort of unpack all the requirements until you actually know what you're looking for concretely and you write it down in a system on paper and everyone agrees to it. That if we did that, that would solve, I think, 99% of it, because I feel like where a lot of the slightly more fuzzy feelings based things come in is you'll get halfway through a process and someone will have their own view of what you're meant to be hiring that might not be correlated with the other people's, and they've used their memory of some other analyst they'd hired who was useless for some reason, and now they're kind of importing it into their framework. But if everyone had figured that out from the get-go, we would be able to distill it down to something that's actually words on a piece of paper. Oh, I understand. You want someone with a high attention to detail who's not going to make stupid mistakes. Like, that's really what it comes down to. And so we could like unfuzzy a lot of this stuff if we really spent more time doing it. What do you think of that approach?
Yeah, no, that sounds actually really good. I think that if you would detail out a lot more of the requirements and the responsibilities of a role that needs to be hired for, that would help a lot. But I feel like there's the other side of it, right? Where companies, especially bigger companies, they actually try to standardize role descriptions, right? They actually don't want very diverging role descriptions being out there, and that every role becomes like 100% new description. They want usually it to be like 80% same, and hiring managers only have like 20% freedom to change what's in there. And that feels like the opposite of what you just described, right? As in that if I only have 20% that I can change of a job description, that's never going to be enough to actually go to the detailed level of what I need to describe what I want for. And the consequence is that those job descriptions are not clarified up front. They only get clarified in the conversations. And people then get surprised that people are not a right fit, or is also maybe especially good fit. But that only appears after like already some time has passed and you had already screened most of the people to then find out, oh, we still need to actually talk about what the job actually entails. And now it's a little bit, no, too late in the process. But I mean, and that has its reasons, right? I know that from an HR point of view, having standardized job descriptions and everything makes it a little bit easier and more consistent, especially to have right candidates. You actually can also find replacements better, and you can find internal rotations in a better way, right? But again, that comes down to then not being able to be super specific when you hire new people.
That's interesting perspective. I hadn't heard that angle before. It's almost like if you had like a almost like a parent job. This is like the general data analyst we're looking for. But then within that, you should be able to say, well, actually, for my data analyst in my team, here's exactly what I need. Because as you say, the later on in the process that comes to the fore, the more time that wastes for everyone, the candidates, the hiring managers, the interviewers, if it's only really by the third conversation that you've really gotten down to what you're needing in the role, that is just so inefficient.
Exactly. And I mean, even with the example of a data analyst, it can vastly differ between different business domains, right? Like a data analyst for sales has a very different one than a data analyst for R&D, very simply put, right? So it's different data types, different stakeholders with different mindsets, with different resistance levels and collaboration attitudes, right? So I can see it diverging a lot between those two job descriptions of what actually is needed.
In your book, you talk about putting people at the center of data strategy. Have you thought about how this might apply to hiring? Like when you've done hiring in the past, have you taken almost like a people-centered approach to hiring?
I mean, I think I very clearly address it by saying how the soft skills are also equally important as much as the hard skills, right? And that we are not actually focusing enough on figuring out if people bring the right soft skills to the job or not. And part of it is very simply put that in specific data jobs like data governance, there's always a high level of resistance and a high level of misunderstanding of what the area you're working in actually means, right? And that, for example, implies that whoever is doing the job needs to be great at breaking the ice, dealing with conflicts, making connections with people, being able to translate complex concepts into simple words, and being able to make people understand. And those are skills that are not usually written down on a data profile, right? Usually start with like SQL, Python, experience with certain tools, right? And not go on that level. And I think Simon Sinek is like one of my favorite kind of organizational psychologists. He said, hire for attitude, train for skills, right? That hard skills are always easier to teach and to adopt than having a certain attitude or a certain personality, right? And so how do we actually then hire for the right personalities instead of only looking at their hard skills and their technical skills? And yeah, so I basically address it by saying when we then hire people and we have job interviews, we should probe it, right? Let's ask people more about when they dealt with a conflict and how they actually, what they learned from dealing with a certain conflict. And just by the answer and how the answer is given, you can learn what the attitude of that person towards conflict management even is, right? Or how, when did you have a time where nobody understood what you were working on and you basically successfully communicated to them and clarified what your focus is, right? And these kind of things in a conversation can really help to, I think, also reveal how good people are in their soft skills. And that for me is like a more people-centric way of hiring for data professionals.
I've been caught between two minds recently when it comes to the development of AI and what it means for the skills people need. So I feel like on one end of the spectrum, I could imagine a time in the not too distant future where super technical things, let's just take coding as an example. In a year, it wouldn't surprise me if no one would ever write a line of SQL from scratch ever again. That you just put your prompt into Claude or whatever, it's going to write the query with 100% accuracy, given enough context, so that really you don't even need to review it. Like it's now done for you. So now maybe SQL will be redundant, maybe not. It's been around for like 60 years, so I feel like it's like the cockroach of technologies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But let's say on one of those end of the spectrum, it's like, okay, so maybe Python skills, maybe data wrangling, maybe the actual analysis, maybe SQL is starting to automate it away, so that what's left over is relatively more people or softer skills that, let's say, a data analyst might need in 2027 versus 2025. But then on the other side, I feel almost the polar opposite, which is like, well, a lot of the work is going to be done by AI. So your skills to interact with AI maybe is going to be way more important than your people skills. Like if you had the combination of programming and acute knowledge of an LLM, that is an explosive skill set that is maybe worth more in investing more in than it is investing in slightly more fuzzy, subjective people skills. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would be very careful, though, to say that AI can completely replace certain skills, because in the end, you still need somebody who can check if what AI generated is the right output or the right outcome, right? And that will always require human expertise over AI outputs, to double check that just for quality assurance. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. I think if we're going to explode in productivity, people are not going to write hands-on manual SQL queries that much anymore. They can just prompt it very easily and get a whole series of SQL queries from a chatbot or like a Copilot, whatever it is, right? And that's going to change the way how we do things. So I think for sure AI literacy, or like dealing with AI tools, is going to be a critical skill in the future, to be able to navigate it and use it in the right way. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, we cannot forget to assure the quality of what comes out of AI, right? And just blindly trust AI to then take what's coming out of there to use it. Because if we all lose that skill to check if it's even correct or not what comes out, there's going to be much worse things happening, right? Which means, right, it's a little bit like becoming more superficial almost about coding and technical skills, because you just need to be able to spot mistakes in the future. You don't need to write queries completely from scratch anymore, or like write any language from scratch anymore. And spotting mistakes is different than writing a whole code on your own, right? So, a little bit of a mindset change, maybe a little bit of a skill set adjacent change. But the way of how we're going to deal with technology is changing for sure.
Feels like, yeah, just another step of abstraction. So nobody writes machine code anymore. Nobody writes low level languages. It's just one step above that. Um, uh, with the needing to still be able to interrogate the output of the LLM to, let's say, verify that it's right. Part of me thinks, hmm, there might be like a quality quantity trade off going on. So I'll give you an example. Let's say at the moment you've got like a centralized BI analytics team, and they get all bombarded with all these requests from stakeholders. Hey, can you help me with this report or help me generate this analysis? And probably those stakeholders are only asking for their top one request, like their most important thing. But maybe if they had some kind of AI analyst who can produce unlimited work, then they wouldn't be limiting it to one request. They'd be just bombarding them with endless requests because they can get endless answers. Now, would you rather have like one human analyst produced report that's, let's say, got 95% accuracy, or 100 AI produced reports that have 90% accuracy? In which case, that step of validation is just it's gone, because it doesn't really matter, because as long as you're right on average, it doesn't really matter if half of the time you're wrong. You see what I mean? I wonder if we might end up in a scenario like that.
I think what you're describing actually potentially happens today already, right? But there's another element to it of what you're describing, which is the prioritization of use cases, simply put, right? Whereas if we all agree on a business use case for data, let's say it's critical reporting for auditing, right? That decides if we are compliant or not. And if we're not compliant, that's connected to a huge fine or something, right? Then there better be some human eyes on it more and more. And it better be 99.9% accurate, so we're not in trouble, right? Whereas, let's say, for example, some operational reporting just to check, let's say, some like walkthrough times, or like some machinery running operational times, right? We probably are asking AI already to create those reports for us, and they're only 90% accurate because some sensors are not always reliable. But that's fine for us, right? We're only looking at the bigger picture, and if there's a certain outliers that we need to really pay attention to, and if certain patterns appear. So I think for now it will really come down to how we prioritize higher and lower priority, and how much we are confident that AI can take on more and more critical use cases for us. But my gut feeling says that we are going to stick with human in the loop for the critical use cases for a while. And only the more less prioritized ones and less critical ones will more and more be replaced by AI generated reports.
I'd be really interested to see what happens with this kind of new wave of AI startups that are like, let's say V2 of the B2B SaaS products, and let's say 10, 20 years ago, but now built based on AI to begin with. Because I imagine a lot of them are coming to the fore with some kind of trade off in mind where it's like, well, you used to have to point and click around this software to do all this manually. We've now removed you as a bottleneck. So, you don't have to do it anymore. It's not as good as what you would have done, but it's good enough and it's done automatically. And so, yeah, there must be all these kinds of use cases where it's fine and we would only get better, but we're probably not going to let it fly a plane anytime soon or do the open heart surgery. I'd rather have the surgeon.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about when it comes to hiring? Have you started to dabble with any AI tools yourself? Have you seen candidates use AI on their end?
Um, well, I mean, to be fair, in my organization, when I'm doing the hiring, I'm usually not in the screening part, right? I only do the subject matter expertise interviews, and they are really face to face or like virtual face to face, but it's a conversation in the end, right? So, I don't think there's a lot of AI that is possible besides like a note taking assistant or something, which even for our data privacy reasons is not a great idea usually at many aspects. So, I'm also not a big fan of it. I'd rather just take a traditional pen and paper notes that are easily destroyable, right? But I think for at least then making sense of my notes, and especially when I have many candidates, I remove all the personal information, but I try to make a little bit more sense of it, of summarizing all my notes into like crisp statements for me, and for me to then be easier to make an evaluation between like more descriptive, like shorter descriptions, for example, right? But that's more productivity based, not really making a decision for me. It's just it helps me to summarize it instead of doing it alone. For candidates, I would say I can only suspect them to use AI or not, but it usually comes down to how their resumes are written when I read them. And it sounds a little bit too generic and not really specific, where it sounds like somebody just asked a chatbot to uh, basically adapt and tailor their descriptions of the experience towards something. And now it sounds really bland and kind of just uses all the right buzzwords, but it doesn't feel like it has a soul almost, right? And that happens pretty often nowadays. I usually give people the benefit of the doubt because I know it's hard right now to apply for a lot of roles and not getting a lot of opportunities. And if you need to save some time, you want to just be able to deal with it all. That's fine. And then it comes down to the conversation if people are honest about what they did do and what they didn't do and what the experiences are recently. But I mean, for the face-to-face interviews, I said I don't think there's so much AI currently being involved right now.
Yeah, I would have thought for most companies there'd be none at the moment at the interview stage. What what about in a year's time? So again, I feel like there's just going to be this sudden wave of B2B AI-driven SaaS products, including in hiring and recruitment everywhere else, that's going to, I think, radically change things. So that even with a human interview, which personally I think in a year or two will just be the last step. I don't think there'd be humans involved much before that, I reckon, boldly. But even if the human's there, is there not something to be said for because it's very one thing with an interview is it's quite hard to focus on the other person, keep an eye on time, take notes, score what they've said. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't have three processes in my brain, unfortunately. So would it not be nice to have like an AI interviewer there with you saying, hey, like, by the way, when you asked this question, did you realize you were being slightly biased or you didn't really record this one correctly, or oh, you scored the candidate 3 out of 6 here. I actually scored them 6 out of 6 because of these reasons. Almost like having another interview there, just to nudge you in the right direction. What do you reckon?
Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't even thought about that. I think it might work, especially if you can train it and fine tune it yourself, right? That it fits to your style more and it gives you a certain kind of feedback in the way you are. That could be really helpful. I mean, I think it's really nice if it tailors the insights and the support towards your needs as an interviewer, but it doesn't replace your decisions, right? It just gives you recommendations and gives you a good reasoning why certain recommendations are there, but you actually still as a human decision that you make in the end. I think that could really work. That could be a really good one.
I Yeah, personally hope something like this gets implemented, especially because I think at the same time it should be able to solve at least, well, technically, it could easily solve candidates' biggest gripe, which is no feedback. Because if the feedback's recorded in a system, it's available for you there, it's integrated, it's like automatically going to be sent to the candidate if you've set it up that way. Like in theory, it should solve that problem. What I fear will actually happen in reality is, though, that companies will be very reluctant to have it by default that they're going to tell candidates anything, um, because then they can be worried about, oh, like, what's the feedback? What have you said? What has the AI said? Is there anything potentially biased in there? Sort of kind of default towards telling them nothing rather than 99% of the time telling them something useful, just because you're worried about a 1 in 100 time. I feel like being cynical where it might go.
Yeah, you're right. Um, that I think with the feedback even that you mentioned, that's a really good point. I mean, having been a candidate myself, I know how frustrating it is, right, to not get any feedback and you get ghosted. Not even a rejection officially comes in, so you just forever not having any contact anymore. I think though, would it be better to get an AI generated one or nothing at all? Because an AI generated one seems equally as much, could seem even more like soulless, and you're just being treated as a production output rather than somebody taking the time to actually show you the respect, right? Because an AI generated message is still not a respect message. And it's in the worst case might be even irrelevant feedback for you, right? So I'm not sure. It's an interesting one. I'm thinking of it from both of a innovation enthusiast point of view, but also like a job candidate, ex job candidate who is, yeah, who are thinking how you I would deal with it, basically, of getting an AI generated feedback message.
Yeah, the framing of it would have to be really done carefully because, as you're right, as a candidate going into the interview, you might be expecting human feedback. So getting AI feedback is actually a disappointment. I agree. Even if you realize on aggregate, most of the time you get ghosted. And so any feedback is better than none. I could appreciate how in that moment for that interview, you might think otherwise. I wonder if it could be almost like if we could make the process of giving human feedback so easy.
It prescribes something for you, right? Exactly. And you just have to like adapt it and adjust it to whatever you think. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, for sure.
What one thing I think that will come about as a result of using AI in hiring is I feel like it will start to shine a light on the inherent subjectivity and vagueness of our requirements. I kind of feel like it could play this role of a psychologist in a way, where if it actually looked at all the comments of every interviewer of what everyone's looking for across the candidates, it would show us the incoherence in what we're looking for. It would show us the bias. It would show us like like, do you guys know what you're talking about? I'll give you a quick example. So I was working with someone 6 to 12 months ago, and they gave us feedback on a candidate, and they told us something like, "Oh, they weren't red enough. They were a bit more yellow than green, or something like using some kind of maybe an HBDI framework, whatever that buckets people into colors. Like, okay, sure." And another feedback for them was, "Oh, I wasn't. They were good, Tim. They were good, but I'm not sure they were really anti-Putin." That was the feedback. So what do I do with that? Like, I'm obviously not going to pass it on to Ken. Hey, by the way, you're amazing analyst, but we weren't convinced of your political leanings vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. Well, yeah, I can't say anything there. So I feel like that's a very difficult conversation to navigate. One thing I think AI is great at, which isn't talked much about, is giving feedback in a way that can't be defensive because you're getting it from an AI, not from a human. It's like, oh, by the way, did you know you mentioned this? You might want to consider that because that's not part of your criteria. Nowhere in the job ad does it say must be pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia or whatever. Okay.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really good point. I mean, I almost feel like though, because AI assistants need to be trained by human data too, right? But if a lot of people are still giving that kind of feedback, then we're definitely feeding the wrong things to an AI assistant too, right? Then worst case scenario, an AI assistant just takes care of political affinities and only looks at that and then uses it actually in a feedback email, that would be horrible, right? For example. So it's a little bit like we need to first role model it for the AI assistants before we can let AI assistants do it, because otherwise they're picking up on the wrong things too. So,
Yeah, I think the goal of what we would want would be some kind of as objective as possible system that, yes, hasn't been optimized based on all our neuroses, biases, discrimination, and the fact that I interviewed a candidate who had my ex-girlfriend from when I was 13, and I had this thing in the back of my head which didn't like people that name, like this kind of ridiculousness that we must bring to it. I just feel like we have this amazing opportunity to improve this kind of layer of subjectivity for the better, albeit we can make things much worse as well with AI. So it is a careful balancing act.
awesome. Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see where things lead us. I think on aggregate, I'm quite optimistic about AI and hiring specifically because I think the current state of things done by humans has so many obvious flaws to begin with. Like, it's so biased. And so some of the claims that people will make about AI and the fears, which are legitimate, are already there in spades in the current scenario. So, in that sense, we're hard to make it worse versus other domains of the world where you could imagine AI creating unlimited lies and propaganda in a way that humans can't, just because of the scale problem. But in hiring, I don't feel like we have that trade-off.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about thinking about your proverbial magic wand? So if you could take this magic wand, it could be AI, it could be nothing to do with AI, and apply it to hiring and sprinkle a little bit of that fairy dust, where would you be sprinkling it? What would you be solving? What would be like perfect click your fingers hiring for you?
I think an accurate screening would be nice, right? I think far too many times still we get candidates in the face-to-face interview phase that are just not a fit for the job. It might not be only negative sides where the person being interviewed has not the relevant skill set. It might be also the overqualification side of things, right? Where it's just another different type of risk, but still a risk to get someone overqualified for it. And noticing it only in an interview seems a little bit late when the real framework for deciding for or against that person is very strict about it. And I always think that it's related to screening and screening rules, for example, right? But if AI could help a little bit by learning from rejections in the past and then creating own patterns of having just a higher quality of people that go into the next phase or in the next stage of the interview process, I think that would be really nice. That would be my magic wand wish, I would say.
I wonder then if the unlock would be some kind of new data sets, like anyone would say, like garbage in, garbage out. Doesn't matter how good your model is. If your data's shit, then the output's going to be pretty crap. And I feel like in the screening challenge, that is part of the problem, which is we have normally just a CV, maybe in an application form they've filled in, maybe a LinkedIn profile. It's like, how much can you really tell from that? Especially now, given, as you say, a lot of them are written with ChatGPT. It has this generic, bland feel to it that seems like it fits the job description, but it doesn't really feel real. So maybe we need a new data set somehow.
I think so, but as was always with like being also working in data governance, right? I'm always a little bit cautious of information that's collected and shared around personal data, right? And I think it can get very personal when it comes to CVs and everything that's on their resumes, cover letters. People share a lot about their personal motivation on there too, and that could be really quite tricky from a legal risk point of view. But other than that, I would actually agree that would be really nice. And I've also thought about how can we anonymize these data sets and so on. That would be really good, right? But it's really tricky. You know that like if you anonymize it and it's still just a sample of one that has a unique profile, you can still map it to the one person that has exactly that skill set in the world, for example. So yeah, I'd only be worried about let's say the legal consequences of it. But in theory, I would agree that that would really be helpful.
Funnily enough, I've seen talking about that anonymization problem, the opposite happened recently. I'm not sure if you've seen these posts, but a recruiter would typically post their job ad in reference to like our client ... and they anonymize it so that they don't have competition coming after them. But I saw a few people using ChatGPT to figure it out. So hey, like, can you figure out what the company is here? And it seems to do it quite successfully by piecing together the dots. So I wonder if you could do the same thing with a candidate. Give it the CV, anonymized, or LinkedIn profile. Yeah, because it might look up the LinkedIn profile and do some kind of comparison. A little bit harder with individuals, I would have thought, than a company. But
Right.
one idea we were playing around with was maybe there needs to be some kind of intermediary between the candidates and the company, because if you're, let's say, a data analyst and you go and apply for a bunch of data analyst jobs, the first couple of rounds, the correlation in what you're asked is very high. Like, you're going to be asked about what have you been doing in your last job? What do you want in your next role? Where do you see yourself in a couple of years? What's your skill set? Like, it's pretty predictable most of the time, I would say. So maybe there needs to be some model where candidates just pre-answer in some kind of validated way a whole bunch of common things, and then it's just like a webhook for companies to then pick up the bits that they care about. Some things is in between like that. I don't know. What do you reckon?
I like that. But at the same time, I appreciate not only usually the answer itself and its content, but also the way it's being transported through mimics, facial expression, right? The kind of the voice and the tonal thing, something that you only pick up as a human being. And of course, you could digitalize it, right? You could do facial recognition, voice recognition, everything. But that makes it also very complicated all of a sudden, right? That you want to now decode it into emotions and likelihood if they're lying or not and so on, which you usually pick up as a person. So yeah, there's something more efficient to it, but at the same time, I think it would be interesting to also get the human touch of it, right? And see how they respond, not just what they respond as well.
This is something we were always torn on with two different directions with our product and business, which was, let's say for video answers from a candidate, should we be, on one hand, anonymizing it, which would be getting rid of the video, transcribing it to text, and then grading the text as an answer? Because that would be, then you don't know who it is, that you can't introduce a bias around their background or whatever. But then, as you say, you clearly are losing some information as well. So it's like you've lost some noise and you've lost some information around how they've actually delivered it. But then is that just another bias? Because, like, how much does it matter how they intonated exactly what they said? I don't know. It's a tricky one.
Yeah. I think I would have to think about that a little more, because people can get really creative, because those are open questions, right? And with open questions, you can get very different answers. And so what is the general comparability across those anyway, across candidates, right? And what do you actually compare? Because it might equally as much likely that they all have the same answer where they see themselves in 5 years, or they have all very different answers where they see themselves in 5 years. And then you still need to judge it with more than just the text. So it's a little tricky, right? So not sure. It's a good thought exercise to have.
You mentioned that, the CVs you've read recently tended to sound a little bit AI generated, which everyone is saying, and that seems to be the case, that now candidates would apply using AI. What we're also hearing is that candidates might, so get the CV written with AI, but also apply en masse to roles with AI. So using some kind of like intermediate tool, which is then creating this weird scenario where there's just like a lot of applicants per role, a lot of noise as well. A lot of the CVs start to look like each other because they've all been written with the same AI.
Yeah.
It feels like a very crowded and noisy market for candidates. If you were applying for a new job now, would you go through the same process? Would you be applying to jobs on a jobs board, kind of fighting it out with everyone else? Or would you try another method? Would you be like going for more the backdoor approach, the networking approach, leveraging people you know?
I think I would try to do both, which means first apply efficiently, but then see if there's any way of being connected with a hiring manager. to start with an informal conversation, right? And it really depends on the company culture and the hiring culture specifically, if that's allowed or not. I would appreciate, though, that if they say, I'm not allowed to have that conversation formally with you, please follow the process. But then I did it already, right? I can just say, okay, fair enough. I already applied officially. I look forward to the next steps, right? And so do it the right way, but also try to do it, let's say, through a more different way. But if the different way doesn't work out, you can always still fight it out with the others. And you did it officially in the right way, too. Right? That's usually my approach.
And is there something to be said also for like leveraging your existing networks? In that scenario, it's like trying to connect to the hiring manager you don't necessarily know, but also could your network unlock doors you might not even be aware exist?
Absolutely. Of course. I mean, looking at, especially on LinkedIn, right? If there's any shared connections, if they can put in a good word for me and everything. I think, sure. I mean, in that case, I would try to, see if there's any other ways to put me in the favor of it. It's also one of the things, right? You might think about if that's fair or not. But creating that network and creating that personal branding itself is also a lot of work, right? So it was more about putting the work in and now having that network that you can benefit from and not having to then create a whole network in the moment of applying for a certain job. So yeah, it's a little bit more of a work distribution too. I would always argue about if that's fair or not.
Yeah, I remember reading a book many years ago now, the details of which I can't remember, but the title stuck with me. And I think it's probably the most important lesson anyway. And it was dig your well before you're thirsty, which is a good one. And yes, you don't want to be frantically trying to network with people while you desperately need a job. You can avoid that in any way possible, then it's worth it, I think. Tiankai, if you could ask our next guest one question, what question would that be?
I would say, and because there's so much cynicism and sarcasm around the data and AI space nowadays, I would ask the next guest, what truly excites you right now in the data and AI space? That would be my question, right? Something where it's not like you just have to be excited because everyone's excited about it, but what truly excites you and why? That would be my question.
Excellent. We will posit that to the next guest, whoever that may be. And in the meantime, yeah, thank you again for coming on and sharing all your wisdom and insights and thoughts, and including a discussion of your book here again, Humanizing Data Strategy. And it's available on Amazon, and that's where I bought it. Any kind of good book retailer would have this, I imagine. Where can people find it?
Lots of regional ones. I learned also there are some libraries that have it now as well. If you could check it out, but yeah, it's available on as the bigger regional retailers too, besides Amazon.
Tiankai, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.